So I think on a topic like this, one thing I want to say first before I get into my points is just that we need to remember like how I guess in society and unfortunately even in the church, just how politically aligned a lot of these issues are, and how politically tied they can be. So yeah, with that said, going into number one, how involved the church should be in eradicating racism from society beyond its fellowships. I think the church should be incredibly involved. I think racism is obviously something that is just outright against the message of Jesus, of God, outside of his original intention and creation. So yeah, I think we should be, um, you know, actively working to eradicate racism. To what extent that is, that's up for debate. But one thing I have heard before is that from Christians is that they've said, well, like ultimate reconciliation, ultimate justice will come whenever Jesus comes back. So, because of that, we shouldn't get too involved with this issue or put too much energy to it. And I don't really think that logic holds up too well, just because, and again, I'm not trying to offend anybody or anything, but a lot of the same people that would say that would be very active in the fight against abortion, which I'm also in support of the church fighting against. Um, so I think a lot of that does have to do with political ties, because if you look in society and I guess the political spectrum, activism against racism tends to be more of a liberal, democratic leaning thing. Um, and most of the evangelical church in America is not in favor of that side of things. They tend to be very conservative politically, and Republican. Uh, so whenever they see Christians getting involved, and I guess that type of movement, they can get alarmed. And in some ways, that's definitely warranted. That kind of goes back to what we talked about with social justice. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with like critical race theory or things like that, but there are definitely aspects of worldly activism, worldly social justice, and the worldly fight against racism that I think can be harmful to the church, harmful to Christians, and things that we shouldn't be involved in. But with that said, I think it's important to remember that like Jesus did tend to temporal issues, and issues that didn't really hold like an eternal, um, I guess, eternal outcome, if that makes sense. So like when Lazarus died, like Jesus still wept. Like he knew Lazarus was going to come back to life, but he still decided to join, um, or I guess be involved in like the human suffering and pain that went on there. Like he still interacted in a way that like a typical human would interact with a situation like that. So I think yeah, just I don't think we can just push things to the wayside and say because ultimate reconciliation and justice will come, um, just because of that doesn't mean that we just ignore the issues that are happening in our world. Um, and I think we are called to fight for justice and to seek justice. Um, getting into more number two, the question number two, to what extent that is, that's where I think things can get tricky. Um, because as I said, a lot of the um, worldly activism has a lot of traits to it that I don't think Christians should be involved in. So one of those being critical theory, which is a very complicated thing to explain. I can't even really give that great of a definition of it, but I think one of the aspects of it that I really don't like is that it kind of places people as you are either an oppressor or an oppressed person. So me as a white person, I would inherently be an oppressor according to race theory, or critical race theory, which I don't think that's a really accurate way of Christians looking at an issue like this, because it's placing our identity and who we are in something that it shouldn't be. As a Christian, my identity is in Christ and God, and not something like that. But at the same time, I think as a white Christian, I should acknowledge, maybe some of the ways I've benefited from racism, whether it was willingly or not, and also acknowledge the suffering that some of my African American brothers and sisters have suffered. And I think Christians in general, I think, should just really uh, look and listen to some of those people, because I think this goes back to the last forum. Uh, there is kind of that divide there as far as cultures go, and it wasn't until I started listening and hearing the experiences and the stories of some black Christians that I wasn't aware of what was really going on in our country until then, and I wasn't aware of some of the experiences that they had. So I think it's really important just to listen to them and hear what they have to say, and just hold their perspective with some weight. Not that they're the be all or the say all end all of anything by any means, but I think it is important to listen to them and hear what they have to say. But yeah, getting into question number 2, just how we get involved. I think it's interesting that we have the example of the civil rights movement in the '60s to look to. I think someone like Martin Luther King gives a pretty good example of how someone can participate in activism and fight against an issue like racism. And on the flip side, you have someone like Malcolm X, who is more militant, a little more violent, more angry, a little more hateful. And I think something like that is what we should steer clear from. So I think that kind of sets up a good guideline, or at least a rough thing that we can look at from history and see how to get involved. I think in today's culture, there's obviously like Black Lives Matter. That is probably the biggest anti-racism group, I guess, or activism against racism. And as far as getting involved in a group like that, I really don't know where I stand. I know that from what I've heard from the leaders of the group, I stand behind at least most of their mission. There's certain things that are outside of the racial fight that they stand for that I'm against, whether that be some like transgender issues, things like that, that are besides the point. But I think as far as when it comes to the race issue, their general stance I agree with, or at least from what I've heard of it. There's, as far as like the people in the group and what they actually participate in and what they do, I think it's really hard to judge if you should get involved in a group like that, because there have been anomalies that have done some pretty horrible things in the group. But yeah, I think I would tend to say that the church should set up its own type of revolt, if that makes sense. I don't know if revolt is the right word at all, but I think the church is supposed to stand out in an issue like this and call out racism when they see it, call out injustice when they see it. If it happens within the church, I think definitely it should be approached and treated. But when it comes to being outside of the church, I think Christians tend to stay quiet on it. And I don't want to get into a whole bunch of this, because I could talk about this for hours, and I'm already at about 8 minutes, and I don't want this to go too long. But I think historically, Christians have been pretty complicit with racism, and up until recently, there have always been Christians that have been against it, absolutely. But I think if you look at history, a lot of Christians have been complicit, unfortunately, and I think it's something that we still contend to do today, just because it's an issue we want to stay out of. Don't want to talk about it. So I think we have to push ourselves to be willing to be uncomfortable and talk about these issues, even if it means we're disagreeing with people within our own group. But doing all of that in a Christ-like, loving way is very important. And while it can be very difficult, I think it's something we need to pursue and look at doing. So yeah, I think just generally, I'm not sure exactly what activism should look like for a Christian in pursuing justice against racism. But I do think it's something we need to be at least somewhat involved in, and at least take a look at and talk about in our churches, talk about as a Christian culture, and just fight against it. So yeah, sorry for the 9-minute ramble, but those are my thoughts.